David, thanks very much for the introduction. It's great to be here today to provide an update on our company, Casia Therapeutics. And as you've heard, we're a biotech company. Our focus is on the development of new cancer drugs, and specifically, our primary focus is on brain cancer. And that's going to be most of what I talk about today. There's really four things I want to try and get across today, four key messages, if you like, which I think are most relevant for investors. The first of these is around the pedigree of our drug, which, by the way, is called Paxil. Now, we're developing Paxil for glioblastoma, which is the most common and the most aggressive form of brain cancer. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But Paxil was developed by a company called Genentech. And Genentech is really one of the very best in the business at cancer drug development. They're responsible for about $40 billion a year of cancer drug sales. They developed our drug up to early human trials and then decided that their company was going to focus elsewhere. They weren't going to focus on brain cancer. And so we were able to partner with them to take it forward. But what this means for investors is that track record is important. And this drug has come out of really some of the best experts in the business at cancer drug development. And I think that says a lot about its pedigree and its heritage. The second thing I think is important is investors are very well aware that the development of a new drug is a long, drawn-out process. Typically, it can take 12 to 15 years to take a drug from the lab to the clinic. And there's a very, very high failure rate along the way. Only about 5% of drugs that enter human trials actually end up as marketed products. So the good news for Paxil is that our drug is very late in that process. We're very advanced in the process of human trials. We are about to begin later this year a pivotal study for registration. That is a study that will look to secure FDA approval for our drug. So we've really been over most of the hurdles that face a new drug in its development, and we now have the final push to make this into a commercial product. Investing in biotech is about managing risk, and although our focus is on glioblastoma, we also have studies going on in other forms of brain cancer. And so this gives us a diversification, if you like. It gives us an ability to weather any unexpected results in any one individual study. And should they all be successful, it gives us access to a very, very much broader market for Paxil. So this is a broad clinical program with a lot of irons in the fire, and that really helps to spread risk for investors. And finally, our company has been well supported by professional institutional investors. We completed just last month an institutional placement that raised in total around $9 million. So in these uncertain times, we are well funded to see our program through the next several rounds of data readouts. And I think we can focus, therefore, on the work rather than on the financing. So let me talk for a couple of minutes about brain cancer, and if I can ask that we just advance twice here on this slide. I've compared here the discovery of new therapies for lung cancer with the corresponding picture in brain cancer. And as you can see, there's been over 20 new drugs for lung cancer in the last decade, and many of these have made a fundamental difference to the outlook for this disease. In brain cancer, by contrast, specifically in glioblastoma, the main drug we use is a drug called temozolomide, which was approved over 20 years ago. And really, the outlook for patients has not improved in the last 2 decades. So this is a disease that has been very underserved by modern medicine. And that's what we're trying to change in Casia. If we move on to the next slide, I've summarized here a little bit of information about glioblastoma, and we can perhaps just advance 5 times here. This is a disease which is not as common as breast cancer or lung cancer, but it's not a rare disease either. It affects about 130,000 patients a year worldwide. It has one of the worst outlooks of any cancer, with average survival of about 12 to 15 months from diagnosis with best available care. So this is really a disease that is a very, very serious prognosis for patients. And as you can see by some of the names of prominent glioblastoma patients illustrated down the bottom, this is a disease which really can affect anybody at any point in their lives. It's a disease that doesn't have particular risk factors or correlations. It's something that can strike almost anybody out of the blue. Moving on, I've shown here the current treatment of glioblastoma. And as you can see, a patient who's diagnosed with this disease today typically goes through 3 stages of treatment. They have surgery, followed by radiotherapy, and they're then treated with this drug, temozolomide, which I mentioned a few moments ago. As you know, this is a drug that was discovered more than 20 years ago, and it's really been around for a very long time. It's a very old school chemotherapy drug. Now, temozolomide does work, but it only works for 1 out of every 3 patients. So for about 1/3 of patients, it will extend life by about 6 or 7 months. But for the other 2/3 of patients, temozolomide offers no real benefit whatsoever. And for those 2/3 of patients, there are no alternative first-line treatments. There's no other drug they can take instead of temozolomide. That's what we're trying to fix with Paxil. We're trying to develop our drug for the 2/3 of patients who will never benefit from the existing drug, temozolomide. And as I say, these patients have no alternative treatment. So it is the very definition of an unmet medical need. Moving on, our drug is part of a class of drugs called Pi3k Inhibitors. And the reason why this is relevant for investors is that there are already 4 Pi3k inhibitors approved by the FDA. So this is really a very well understood, very well proven, well tested, well validated way of treating cancer. We know that Pi3k inhibitors work. The unique thing about our drug, the unique thing about Paxil, is that it is the only Pi3k inhibitor which is able to cross the so-called blood-brain barrier. Ordinarily, the blood-brain barrier protects the brain from toxins, but it becomes a real challenge in treating diseases like multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's disease, or of course, brain cancer. Most of our cancer drugs do not get into the brain very well, and this really makes them ineffective for brain cancer. Paxil has been developed specifically to cross the blood-brain barrier. We know that it does it very well. And this gives it an absolutely unique advantage out of all the drugs in global development in the treatment of this disease. Next slide, please. So I've shown here some of the data that's been emerging from clinical trials of Paxil. I mentioned that we're well advanced in human testing of this drug, and we've been seeing some extremely positive data emerge from this. And I've summarized here some data that was recently presented at the American Society for Clinical Oncology conference in the United States. And we've looked at 2 measures of efficacy. Progression-free survival measures the ability of the drug to delay growth or regrowth of a tumor. And on this measure, we see about 8.5 months for Paxil versus 5.3 months for temozolomide, which is quite a material difference in the field of oncology. Overall survival looks quite simply at how long patients survive on treatment. And again, we see a very substantial difference between patients treated with Paxil and those treated historically with temozolomide, 17.7 months versus 12.7 months. So this is quite a substantial difference on the face of it, and it's something we need to verify in a larger study where we compare the 2 drugs head to head. But if these results continue to bear out in a larger study, we have no doubt that this will be a very commercially competitive product. Now, clearly, our long-term goal is to extend survival far beyond this, and ideally to even turn cancer into a chronic disease. But realistically, very, very few drugs are curative at this stage. And in a disease like glioblastoma, being able to provide this sort of magnitude of benefit is very, very material. Next slide, please. Now, this represents a very substantial commercial opportunity as well as obviously the benefit for patients with this very challenging disease. glioblastoma alone is generally estimated to represent about a $1.5 billion US market per annum. And we believe that Paxil could well be the next drug approved for this disease, and as such will have a very, very significant claim on a large part of that market. But beyond that, as I mentioned, we are developing the drug in other forms of brain cancer, and those all represent upside for the drug. So although glioblastoma is our gateway indication, we do see a lot of opportunity for the drug to extend beyond that. And even beyond brain cancer altogether, these kinds of drugs, Pi3k inhibitors, are used in the treatment of diseases like breast cancer and blood cancers. And there's no reason why our drug couldn't be competitive there. Its unique feature is the ability to cross the blood-brain barrier, but in other respects, it is no less a drug than any other. And just briefly, some of the areas we've been looking at in terms of growth opportunities for Paxil. You see there our own study in glioblastoma on the left, but there are also studies ongoing right now in the United States in DIPG, which is a childhood brain cancer, and 3 studies in metastatic brain cancer. Now that's cancer that has spread from elsewhere in the body to the brain. And when, for example, breast cancer or lung cancer spreads to the brain, it becomes very difficult to treat. So this is also an area of real need. One of the things that's been most gratifying is that we've seen each of these studies largely funded by the institutions that are running them. So they give us a real free carry, if you like. And then finally, we've hit all our milestones so far this year. We have some key ones coming up. We have data as soon as next week at the AACR conference, and I'll come to that in just a moment. On the next slide, I'll just say a brief word about our company. We are ASX listed, as David mentioned. We have a market cap of approximately 40 million Australian dollars. And we recently completed an institutional placement followed by a share purchase plan. So we are well funded for our next few rounds of data readouts. On the next slide, I've summarized just a little bit about the long term for the company. Although we are on the path now to product registration, that isn't necessarily the only way that we can realize value from Paxil. Many companies like ours partner with larger companies or indeed are acquired by larger companies to commercialize their products. And I've shown here some of the kinds of recent transactions that have taken place. Finally, as I mentioned, there's a lot of near-term news flow for our company, some important and very material data readouts coming up in the near future, and we'll look forward to sharing those with investors. And on my final slide, I'd just say we have a lot more information on our website. We also have a contact facility there. We're always delighted to hear from shareholders. And next week, we will be presenting data at the AACR annual conference. It is free to register, so we recommend that for any interested investors. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and look forward to fielding any questions.
James, thanks for such a great presentation, clearly playing in a very important space. Just talk us through a little bit about the placement and the SPP. What we generally find, I suppose, with biotechnology companies is it is a long game, and you've got to be patient and you've got to understand each of the steps. You've clearly attracted strong investors who understand sort of the game that you're in and the hurdles that you've already jumped through to get you to where you need to go. So can you share a little bit about the type of investor that you've attracted and why they're taking this long-term view?
Yeah, David, absolutely. So our recent placement was almost completely taken up by professional institutional investors and mostly by sector specialist investors. That's to say those focusing on the life sciences sector. We did have an accompanying share purchase plan for existing shareholders because we always take the view that where we possibly can, any opportunity we offer to new institutional investors, we want to offer the same opportunity to our existing shareholders. As you say, young growth startup companies like ours go through several rounds of financing typically before they become financially self-sufficient, but we do want to make sure that we manage that very fairly. I think what investors see in us is really a few key things. They see clearly the pedigree of the asset and the validation that that is offered by other drugs in this class. I think they feel very confident that there's a sound scientific rationale for what we're doing. I think they see the positive data that's emerging from the program and the signal that provides. Investors also look, I think, very closely at the quality of our collaborators. We work with some of the top experts in brain cancer in the world, places like Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, MD Anderson, and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And that really reassures investors that if the top clinicians are on board, then that's a positive sign. So I think all those things we hear as being points of real encouragement for the investors that look at our company.
And although when compared to the big pharma groups out there, you're small but clearly nimble, how attentive is big pharma to what you're doing?
Look, I think we're being watched closely. You know, I think the more we present data at these large international conferences, the more we get on the radar of these larger companies. I think it's fair to say brain cancer has historically been a really challenging area. And so the burden of proof, if you like, to really get the confidence of a larger company is high. But I think we're really earning that credibility. We remain in constant contact with a range of potential long-term partners. We share our data as it emerges. And I think we're really starting to build that trust, that confidence in the Paxil story. So I think it's always a long-term courtship in partnering, but I think we're really investing the hard yards in getting that confidence around the drug.